Hey guys, it's CarsonLee. If you're new here, I make writing and reading content, and today I am here to talk about writing craft books. So Lindsay Puckett made a video recently reviewing a whole bunch of writing craft books that she had just read. I'll leave her video linked down below. If you don't follow her, you really should. She's pretty awesome, and I love hearing about her projects. She recently wrote a middle grade witch book that I love hearing about, so subscribe to her if you're not already. She's awesome. But she was talking about, I think, 23 or something craft books that she's read recently, and I recently made a video about my thoughts on Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And I just didn't like the video. The video was disorganized and I didn't know exactly what it was. Was it a review? Was it just me chatting? So once I saw her video about craft books, it made me want to talk about craft books in general and what I think about them. Her video is more of a review and mine is more of just a chatty conversation. So with me today, I have 5 craft books that I've read semi-recently, and we're going to talk about them when I come back because my battery is dying right now. Alright, I'm back. I'm going to give a quick introduction to the craft books that I have with me here. I have read other craft books, but because these are the ones I have at my house with me right now, they're the ones that I'll be referencing as I kind of generally talk about my feelings on craft books. So the first one we have here is Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. It is really about screenwriting. People really love the Save the Cat method. I was not a big fan of this book. I didn't find it particularly helpful, and I wasn't a huge fan of the way that he explained things personally. The next one is Save the Cat Writes a Novel. People are huge fans of this on AuthorTube. I did enjoy it a lot more than I enjoyed the first one. I thought that Jessica Brody, who is the person who kind of interpreted Blake Snyder's Save the Cat and wrote it specifically for novels, she really breaks it down well and gives a lot of details about how to plot using the Save the Cat beat sheet and what different novels look like, different genres of novels. I found this really helpful and interesting, and a lot of these sticky notes, while they are notes on the book, a lot of them are revelations that I had about my books personally, which I love having that in a craft book because that just means that it's inspiring you and kind of doing its job in a sense. The next one I have here is The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. Very good book. I used this book specifically to help me plot out my current work in progress, Might, and I found it super helpful in terms of looking at characters, character development, and kind of knowing exactly where I was starting before I started. So I definitely recommend this book. If you haven't read it, pick it up. The most recent craft book that I just finished is Thrill Me by Benjamin Percy. This is a collection of essays on different topics about writing. It's not really a step-by-step tutorial like the first 3 that I talked about are, but it is very fascinating, and while some of the essays are kind of repetitive, some of them have good insights that I had never heard of before in different craft books. So I don't know that you necessarily need to own this, but I would recommend picking it up at the library when you have free time. It's really short, and just giving it a little bit of a flip through. And then the last book that I have here with me today is The Wonder Book by Jeff Vandermeer. If you've never seen this book, it's beautiful. It is huge. It has all of these giant illustrations. Jeff Vandermeer writes the main content for this book, but then we have gorgeous pictures that he includes and essays from different authors in all different genres, not necessarily just science fiction and fantasy, though that is what this book primarily talks about. And this book goes through different steps of writing a novel. So it talks about characters, inspiration, a story, talking about narrative choices, and revisions. So I have read this officially cover to cover, which was one of my goals for this year, and Kind of like how I felt about Save the Cat and John Truby. It was very useful. I found things in here that I've never seen before. The illustrations are gorgeous. It is a hefty book, and if I'm not mistaken, I think the price tag is a little high. I will leave all of these linked on Amazon if you're interested, so you can go check them out on your own. But I would recommend having this because it's really cool. Unless you're not writing fantasy and science fiction, or you have no interest in fantasy and science fiction, then maybe check this out at the library. You don't have to purchase it, but if you ever think, you know, maybe you're gonna write something with a speculative element, I would get this because it's just really cool. So, craft books. That's what we're here to talk about. My relationship with craft books has been kind of up and down. And I just want to go through a couple of kind of overarching questions about craft books that I've been thinking about while I've read most of these pretty recently. So the first thing I want to talk about is, are craft books useful? The answer is obviously yes. Craft books are useful. I think sometimes you can get a little bogged down by the language of craft books. Sometimes writers make it sound like their way is the only way to do it and other ways are wrong. Benjamin Percy is a little heavy-handed with his advice in this book, but he openly admits that he's a little heavy-handed with his advice and that he has students disagree with him all the time and they do it well, and he agrees with the way they disagree with him. So it didn't bother me as much in his book, but I think for references they are awesome. I also would stray away from just reading one craft book. I think you see that a lot on AuthorTube, that people are really applauding one craft book as the way to write, as what to use. Obviously, the two that come to mind that people talk about most often are The Anatomy of Story and Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Both of these books are really great. I would suggest reading both of these books, but I think craft books become more useful the more craft books you read. As you consume more and more of them, you begin to see that everybody has a different take on things and everybody does things a different way, including you. You don't have to follow exactly what another author does to be a good author. So when you write, you don't need to write like John Truby or Jessica Brody or Blake Snyder or Jeff Vandermeer. You can write like you and use elements from what they're telling you to strengthen your writing. So I do think craft books are useful, but I think their usefulness multiplies the more that you read them and the more you begin to use them as references for how you want to do things, or kind of diagnosing plot issues or character issues within your own work, rather than using them as, you know, the end all be all of how to write a book, how to plot a book, how character arcs go, because everybody does things a little bit differently, and especially for novice writers, which I still count myself in that, even though I've been writing for, you know, over a decade. I'm not published. Nothing I've written has gotten to be read by, you know, the world. So I'm definitely still a novice, and I think that when I first started reading craft books, I would get so overwhelmed by the first one I read because I felt like I had been doing it wrong, which is probably true about certain things that I'm doing, certain ways that I am writing, but not about everything. I'm not doing everything wrong. I could just be doing it the way that I like to do it. So yeah, that's my opinion on if they're useful. The next question I want to talk about is, who should buy craft books? I think everybody should experience reading craft books or essays on the craft of writing pretty frequently. You don't need to buy them. Like I said when I was introducing some of these books, some of them I recommend you getting from the library if you're interested in reading them, and others I think would be great to have as references to write in and highlight and go back to over and over again. But I'm a college student, I don't have a lot of money. I understand that these people who have a collection of craft books, especially books that, you know, start to get into, you know, wonder book status where it's kind of a hefty price tag for a craft book and something that you may look at and say, like, am I really gonna read this entire book full of different diagrams and mini essays and things like that? But regardless of whether or not you buy them, I do think that they're useful. There's also tons of essays online from authors that they make public, or authors that have their websites that you can go to and reference. I will link a few of them below. Popping into my head is Susan Dennard, because I'm using her revision plan for my novel Valor, and Tomi Adeyemi, who wrote Children of Blood and Bone. I know that she also shares really awesome craft tips on her website, so I will leave both of those linked down below. There are also podcasts that are free to listen to. Writing Excuses comes to mind because I love Writing Excuses. I've been listening to them every day since I've been home because I had quite a backlog of their podcasts to catch up on, which I'm now caught up on, and very sad that I have to wait until Monday to get the new ones, just like everybody else. But again, I'll leave them linked down below if you've never watched, if you've never listened to them. But craft advice is always useful, and you don't need to go to a class to get craft advice or take creative writing classes. It is available online for free, and there are also these books that you can buy and get from the library. So do I think you need to pay top dollar for craft advice? No. Do I think that it's useful to consume craft advice as a writer? Yes. The next topic I have is specifically for John Truby and Blake Snyder, and it's screenwriting advice for novelists. Both of these men are screenwriters, and they are talking about specifically screenwriting, although John Truby is talking about stories in general, and it does apply directly to writing, as does Blake Snyder's book Save the Cat, which is evidenced by Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is just an adaptation of his information, but specifically for novelists. I think that screenwriters and novelists are the same in that we are invested in telling a good story. Where I think it differs sometimes is that screenwriters are invested in generally what is easy and what will sell. And easy doesn't mean bad at all. There are phenomenal movies, but when you look at those phenomenal movies, you can break down how they develop the character, how the plot is super linear, and a lot of novels don't follow a structure like that. There's a growing amount of experimental novels coming out that are phenomenal and don't follow kind of the movie formula, the film formula for what is good and what sells. So if you are weary about screenwriters writing for novelists, they do have good things to say, because like I said, at the end of the day, we are all invested in telling a good story, and in that regard, what they're saying is useful, especially if you are new to plotting and you don't really know all of those important beats to have in a traditional story, but they look at things from a different perspective than novelists do, especially because these are both kind of mainstream people within film and the screenplay world. They aren't necessarily working on a lot of indie experimental stuff, which a lot of novelists are. So if that's your thing, maybe they're not the people to look to. But again, like I've said a million times in this video, I think reading a lot of craft advice and taking in a lot of that information is never a bad thing. And then the last thing I want to talk about is kind of the emotional journey of reading craft books, because I have been through a lot reading craft books. They can be extremely helpful, but when I started reading them, I would get really upset and I would lose my motivation to write because I was reading about craft. That is not the point of craft books, and that definitely fades as you continue to read them. Like I said, when I read my first craft book, I felt completely overwhelmed and like I had failed, like everything I had written was wrong, which isn't true. Again, it's hard to look at other people's way of doing things, especially when they're presenting it as the only way of doing things, which it's never the only way of doing things. There's a million different ways to plot books and to track character arcs, and every author, even if they think they're following the same formula, does it differently. And pretty much every author does it differently for every book that they write too. It's not the same across everything that they've produced. So be warned, if you're watching this video and you've never read craft books, there is a gut punchy, chest tightening kind of feeling when you first start reading this genre of literature, but I can guarantee you that that will go away the more that you consume, and it'll get easier to see that these people are they're not the gods of writing. They're just trying to help you figure out what works best for you. And maybe it's what they do, and maybe it's not what they do, or maybe it's half of what they do and half of what you do, or a quarter of what they do and half of what somebody else does. There's a million different ratios for what your writing looks like in comparison to other people's writing, and it's really easy to play the comparison game when you're reading a craft book by this writer, but you shouldn't play the comparison game. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit at the end here and give a disclaimer that it's easy to feel down on yourself and down about your writing when you're reading craft books from people who obviously did it well enough for people to want to publish their craft book. But their craft books are not the only way to write, as evidenced by the fact that there are a million different craft books. Be cautious going into them, but I definitely think they're worth looking into as long as you are being aware of what their worth actually is and not looking at them as anything more than just a resource to help you write better. So that's kind of all I have to talk about today. Let me know in the comments down below if you have read craft books or have an interest in reading craft books and what you think about them in terms of their usefulness and in terms of their usefulness. I would really love to know. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys in my next one. If you like what you saw and you want to see more writing and reading content from me, please subscribe down below. I'd love to have you guys here, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!